Sigi Sheesh, Masha Hilly. A Gwinushla Zakorja is Mission Tullov Porgo Gaira, Uchtron Okative Riog Nahiran, August Taught Awesome, Taught on Hasarum, Falcha Kurov Galair Gdean Okative in you. So good evening, everybody. My name is Professor Pat Gyrey, and it's my privilege and honour to be President of the Royal Irish Academy. And I'm joined here this evening by the Senior Vice President, Professor Imelda Marr. You're very welcome, Imelda. And we'll welcome you to the Royal Irish Academy for tonight's discourse, Cyber Resilience, Trust and Digital Security. So this is the second discourse in our 2025-2026 series, which will examine resilience from a range of different perspectives with distinguished speakers, seated to my right, who are experts in their various fields. So a bit of background on the Academy discourses. First of all, a quick question. How many people first time here in Academy House? Show of hands, please. Good. About 15, 20%. Good. Well, you're very welcome. And it's one of the most outstanding rooms, I think, in Ireland. So it's a real pleasure to be here to host these events. And I hope you enjoy it if this is your first time here. So the Academy Discourses are the oldest and most renowned series of talks in Ireland. The first discourses were presented all the way back in 1786. Historically, they were the occasion reserved for the most distinguished academics to first reveal and discuss their work in public. We now record these discourses and they are available on the Academy's website, www.ria.ie. Before we begin, we have some short Academy business to undertake. The minutes of our last discourse, Encountering Resilience, Tracing its Intellectual Roots, which took place on the 30th of September, were posted online. Since our members did not inform us of any issues with these minutes, I have to say they rarely do, but nevertheless, I will take these as approved and I will sign the minute book after this discourse concludes. So I'd like to welcome, on behalf of the Academy, our esteemed speakers for this evening's discourse. So to my right, first to your right also, Siobhan Clarke is Professor, and she's the moderator for this evening, is Professor of Software Systems at Trinity College Dublin. Her research expertise is in software engineering models for the provision of smart and dynamic software services to urban stakeholders, addressing challenges in the engineering of dynamic software in ad hoc mobile environments. She has supervised 25 PhD students to completion to date, and Siobhan is the founding director of Future Cities, the Trinity Centre for Smart and Sustainable Cities. She's deputy director of the Connect Research Ireland Research Centre and previously led the National Enabled Science Foundation Ireland Research Programme on connecting communities to smart urban environments through the Internet of Things. Professor Clarke recently joined the Communications of the Association for Computing Machinery editorial board, and she was elected as a member of the Royal Irish Academy in 2023. To the extreme left, Dr. Lubna Luxmi is an associate professor at the Department of Electronic and Computer Engineering at the University of Limerick and is a senior member of IEEE. So for those in the game, what that means is the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers. She is Ireland's first IEEE Women in Engineering Ambassador and a member of LIRO, which is Research Ireland's Research Centre for Software. And as principal investigator, she leads the Research Ireland-funded MRIA Cyberwise and EU-funded Catch VR projects, and also contributes to the EU Cyber Resilience Act. Ideal speaker for this evening. She's also developed the Information Technology, Operational Technology, Cybersecurity Blueprint for Johnson & Johnson Smart Pod Factories, and her research focuses on cybersecurity, standards, emerging technologies, cyber law, regulations, and cyber physical systems. She's currently involved in projects related to marine Internet of Things cyber resilience, artificial intelligence, machine learning in healthcare security, V2X safety, and 5G security. She also champions women in STEM and is a former Dell STEM Star mentee and was honoured with the SFI Confirm Education and Public Engagement Champions Award in 2021. Richard Browne, Centre, is a principal officer leading the Internet Policy Division in the Department of Communications, Climate Action and the Environment. His responsibilities include national cybersecurity policy and oversight of the National Cybersecurity Centre, as well as Ireland's Internet Governance Policy. Not yet present, somewhere on a train between Galway and Dublin, or maybe on a taxi from Houston Station to Dawson Street. Hopefully to join us soon will be Dr. Brendan Flynn, who's an associate professor at the School of Political Science and Sociology and current head of political science within the school at the University of Galway. His research interests and publications focuses on maritime security, resilience, and the intersection between energy, climate change, and security more broadly. He has taught a range of courses at both undergraduate and postgraduate levels, as well as making contributions to several command and staff courses of the Irish Defence Forces. He's a frequent media commentator on security development and Irish politics. So now to the discourse. I'll hand over to you, Siobhan. Thank you very much.
Gormagat, thank you. So you're all very welcome here. I'm delighted to be amongst these multidisciplinary experts because, I mean, cyber resilience and trust and security is very much in all our minds. And I know lots of people, they worry about their finances or they worry about their health records or whatever. And it's a very broad area. So for example, it's not all about theft. So we all kind of worry about it from that point of view. So we worry about it from the point of view, like say, for example, the HSE that was a criminal act. But there's also acts that the code doesn't work. And speaking as a computer scientist, that's not a surprise to me. Sometimes code doesn't work, like the Cloudflare problem a couple of days ago. So it's really quite a broad thing. So first, what I'd like to ask the panelists is, like, what is cyber, and what does it mean? Do you believe, and like, what does cybersecurity? So cyber and cybersecurity, what is that all about? In broader terms. So let's start with Lubna.
Well, cybersecurity. As we're living in a digital decade, everything is fully connected. We have from phones to laptops to devices to network. So everything has become, relies on a network, relies on the network, relies on the connectivity. So this is what I call the cyber environment, the digital environment, or the digital decade that we rely on. And we need to secure every point, every means through which data is traveling. So as it is, if you look at the word cyber, it comes from the Greek. It has that type of orientation. If we go at the meanings and the description of it, but as we look at the broader aspect, it's kind of giving that digital element to any physical device, to every system device, to connectivity. That's what I would rather say in a layman's language that we would call cyber.
You to add to that, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, first of all, just the bio is slightly out of date. We're in the Department of Justice now, and I don't deal with policy anymore. I just deal with the operations of the NCSC. So I'm not speaking from a policy perspective. Cyber, I mean, as Lubna's pointed out, the origins go to the originally 1940s and cybernetics, which is really about computing, and particularly about gun lane computing, actually. But what it means in the current context is network and information security. So from a legal European law perspective, we're talking about the security of network and information systems. So computer networks, any device, system, item that touches the internet is part of cybersecurity. More generally speaking, to paraphrase what Lubna has said, we've created a constellation of connected devices which runs much of our daily lives. The systems we rely on in terms of banking, healthcare, everything are all based on this constellation of devices connected to a network that is fundamentally insecure. The network was never intended to be used for critical systems or services. It was an academic experiment that essentially got out of hand. Many of the frameworks we use don't have formal, proper global governance in the same way you would if you buy a car. You buy a car with a CE cert and a standard. Most software doesn't have the same bill of rights and the same bill of goods. So we've created, almost by accident, a critical virtualized environment that is on the one hand insecure, but also a domain of interstate conflict, a domain of criminal activity, and a domain of commercial competition. And it is that complexity, the multi-layered, multi-component element of this that gives it that particular difficulty when it comes to resilience.
So that's very interesting. I mean, I might bring you in to talk to my advanced software engineering module at master's level, because I think certainly I've been in software for about 40 years now, and it has always upset me, I suppose, that lack of professionalism, you could almost call it, in compared to, for example, with engineers. Like, they can't just go out and build bridges, whereas lots of people think they can just go out and build software, which might be part of what our problem is. So that's something I rant on about with my master's students quite a bit. But moving on from that, Richard, so I mean, you're the director of the National Cyber Security Centre. So what does this all mean for Ireland, do you think? Like, is there a geographical notion? Is there a defence element, security? So what for Ireland in cybersecurity and resilience?
So that's a huge question, and I'll try and keep the answer to under an hour. So the long and the short of it is that the nature of the way risk presents for states is differentiated by their situation, their geographical location, their economic basis, their substrate, if you like, their own social and economic context, and even the institutional architecture around security. So it is a function of all of these things, and a product of all of those things. Sorry, function in a formal sense. Sorry, just to go back, is software engineer a paradox? Discuss. Anyway, sorry.
A different discourse for a different time.
So what it means from a national perspective. So we have a new national cyber risk assessment that will be published in the next week, hopefully on Monday morning. And that risk assessment calls out a tiered series of pressing problems for us today. And it's a useful lens through which to look at all these questions. Hey, Brendan.
Hello.
One of them is that we face an incredibly complex geopolitical environment in Europe at the moment. And Europe, the regional context is important. We're dealing with a situation where not only do we have a pressing land war in Europe, nearly 4 years old now, where we have state actors engaged in ongoing offensive cyber operations against countries with which they're ostensibly at peace. We also have degrading international norms of state behavior, where you have other state actors openly saying they will use contestable cyber means, the US, for example. So we have this degrading security environment, which places lots of risk in a broader sense, which has manifestations in the cyber domain. Secondly, we also have supply chain risks in the sense that we're dealing with these extended complex supply chain arrangements that have differential manifestations. So again, you mentioned Cloudflare. We have arrived at a situation whereby much of the infrastructure we deal with is premised on the economic activity of a small number of vendors. But that reliance is often invisible until the day it goes wrong. In other words, you might have multiple different providers of critical infrastructure reliant on one single vendor, but the public or even government may not be aware of that until the morning it all falls apart. And simultaneously, an airport, a bank, a public transport system, a social welfare system might all fall over. And this systematic risk is a key problem for states. And then the last one is the simple fact that supply chains themselves are a target of criminal actors. You have states who may seek to use their power over vendors that might be in their own jurisdiction. You have vendors who, quite frankly, may not pay that much attention to their own security. So managing the supply chain risk at a governmental level, a national level, is in of itself an increasingly pressing problem. We also have technological changes, by the way. I'm not going to be the first person to mention it, but there's this new evolving technology in the artificial intelligence space that poses dramatic risks today, but looks likely to pose even more significant risks into the future. And those emerging disruptive threats, or EDTs, for us are a major source of risk, because we know we can keep track of the risks we're dealing with right this second, because we do it. Things are not falling over all the time, although we do have issues. But we can't say with certainty that what the trajectory of risk we're looking at in the next 3 to 5 to 7 years is going to be manageable. So the state is just having now to look into the medium term and take very quick measures now to be ready for that.
Welcome, Brendan. So do you have anything to add then, sir, what it means for Ireland, the cybersecurity?
Yeah, sorry I'm late because of physical infrastructure, not cyber infrastructure. I noticed that when you look at Ireland's footprint, we're one of the more digital countries, perhaps more digital than we realize. I was looking at a couple of European Commission documents, and one of the measures they have is the amount of cloud computing and cloud services that are purchased, and Ireland comes about 4th or 5th. Interestingly, Estonia, which I thought would be number 1, often highlighted as the always-on digital society, is lower down than us. Malta is a little bit ahead of us. That was a surprise to me. But the Scandinavians were all up the top with the Dutch. We were about 4th or 5th. When you do measures of digitalization, and by the way, that's tricky to measure, but assuming you do a composite measure of what digitalization is, guess what? Ireland turns out to be 4th or 5th. Our business model, our society, our culture, the society we are, is incredibly digital. So if anything goes wrong in the digital space that Richard and others are involved in policing and watching, we have a serious problem. We have a problem with our business, we have a problem, but also with our lifestyle, the connections we have, our families. who are in Australia or in Boston, who are all over the world. So Ireland's profoundly vulnerable. We're such a small actor in a globalized world. And as the world becomes more multipolar, I'm afraid it also becomes, in some ways, if I can say, more bipolar, where you have very aggressive state actors who are using and throwing around power. And so a small little country becomes vulnerable to coercion and coercive plays. And one of the easy, cheap ways to try and coerce or bully somebody in that big school playground we call the United Nations is cyber means. And it could happen to a little Ireland, even in the context of our EU membership.
So we might hand back to our Director of National Cybersecurity.
I mean, there's lots
anything?
to comment on that. We'll have plenty of time to go through it. But one thing just to pick up really quickly, our dependencies are not just our dependencies. There are many other states who rely on systems that are here, and vice versa. So this interdependency and this shared risk, particularly within the European Union, is really important, because we don't just look after our infrastructure. Because of the vast amounts of cloud here, we look after lots of other people's infrastructure as well.
So one of the interesting things I came across was the digital decade, the EU's digital decade 2030. And if you look at Ireland there, and there's a document that states that Ireland will 10% of the population, like will build capacity to an extent that 10% of the population will contribute, will be effectively skilled to an extent that they will contribute to that digital decade thing. And we're just 5 years away from it. And if we look at that point, it's far-fetched. We're not even 1% on that scale. So it's really high time. We need to build up those competencies. We need to build, like, as Richard mentioned, that critical infrastructure. And then we have our utilities, and we have our healthcare, and we have fintech. And then we're dealing with different type, like AI and Gen AI. There's just kind of a startup when we are looking at a time where quantum communications have been successful. They have been successful. If you look at the Cyber Resilient Act, just early in the year, we had a mock thing where we're talking about human transportation and how CRA can, build resilience within that quantum environment. How can quantum and those things come together so that there's no compromise? So we're talking about far advanced, use cases and things. We don't know it. You can only mitigate a risk when you know it. If you don't know that there's a risk, if you can't identify a risk, so we need to build up competencies where we can be proactive before, not reactive. So right now, what we're doing, an attack is happening, or we're looking at those certain spaces, or bridging those small gaps, building competencies, educating the next generation. But then, from a cybersecurity perspective, I think we need to ramp up in a lot of places. And again, it's not just, I'm talking about cyber. It can be cyber in business, cyber and law, looking at the regulatory and compliance and risk and, intrusion detection, intrusion prevention. So we need, because as Richard mentioned, cyber is not just, so wherever your data is flowing, there needs to be cybersecurity. It doesn't matter if it's a big device, small device, an IoT sensor, if it's exploited, one of them, the whole fortress falls down. So building those competencies is very, very important. And that's what, one of my roles is.
So Brendan, I know you have a bit of a bee in your bonnet about the hybrid physical and cyber resilience, that it's not, we shouldn't just be talking about cyber resilience.
Yeah, because I think, it's sometimes attractive to just put cyber in a space and say it's this really important exotic space, but it's somehow divorced from kinetic, as the military and the police sometimes talk about physical attacks. And then, as Richard was pointing out, the context in which we're discussing security in the last 3 years, 4 years, is very different from what it was, before that, which is this very orchestrated campaign of hybrid aggression, which is going on, most of it on land, some of it perhaps on sea, and an awful lot of it at various levels in the cyber domain. But the point is that it's at multiple levels, and a lot of the hostile actors, and I'm talking specifically about states, their conception of how they deploy force is they don't just do it in the cyberspace. They're not just going to play in the cyber sandbox. They're going to mix it up. And so you could then have attacks, higher level attacks, which are increasingly mixing up at the same time in the same place. So what does that look like? We've already seen attacks which are disruptive, annoying attacks, but they do have a huge cost on the airport system in Europe with drones flying around. It's hard to get to the bottom of that, but it's a very worrying pattern. Imagine if you had a cyber disruption event occurring in the airport system, the air traffic control system, or the airline booking system, and how the airlines manage fuel. There's multiple patterns in which cyber enable our airports, right? And then you also have a physical interference through, for instance, drones, both happening at the same time. And then a third level, which is disinformation, misinformation being industrially farmed and inculcated and distributed across social media platforms. So you have 3 levels of attack. And when the 3 levels of attack are synergized by somebody who's really hostile and really determined, that's an order of magnitude beyond what we've experienced. Is it likely tomorrow? I don't think so. I hope not. But should we be prepared for it? Absolutely, we should.
For sure, yeah. I mean, it sounds like we have a lot to worry about, and I hope so. It may not be enough. So I'm going to ask Richard another hard one. I mean, how are we protecting ourselves here in Ireland?
I'm going to go back to Brendan's just comments briefly because he's absolutely right. But the way we tend to conceptualize this state-led question, which is the fastest way of getting to the answer, Louis XIV used to describe it as canons, apparently ultima ratio regnum, that canon were the last argument of kings. Cyber in many ways is the first argument of kings. It's much more closely premised to the intelligence gathering, influence operations than it is to kinetic, because frankly, it's a terrible kinetic weapon. It can be done, but it's expensive, it's slow, it's unreliable. The way we tend to rely to discuss it internally, because I work with a lot of people who used to be military, cyber doesn't kill people, artillery kills people, but cyber is a really good spying tool. So that's the kind of metric we place upon it. It's good at disruption, it's good at espionage, it's not so good at actually breaking stuff, but it can.
Well, can I pick you up on that?
Yeah.
What if somebody takes control of your car? They could kill you.
So the answer to that is it can happen, but it's very rare. So on the risk, as we look at risks from a national perspective, it's entirely possible that they can. It's much more likely they will compromise the sensors on the car and the microphone in the car to listen to what you're saying or to record the outside. There's also international law components with actually killing lots of people, but that's a separate conversation. What do we do? How do we defend the state against issues like that? We always tend to break it down into 3 because it's easy to remember. The first one is we actively detect, monitor, and respond to incidents as they happen in the NCSC. So we have a whole range of programs in place, and I could go into them if anybody wants to detail on detecting incidents in the wild, tracking vulnerabilities before they turn into incidents, get as left of the bang as possible. So get to an incident as far before it becomes an incident as we possibly can. That's the single most dramatic thing we do, and we have a lot of history in that. And by the way, we deal with several 400 or 500 incidents every year, and of which about 15 to 20% are nation state in origin. So this happens all the time. It's not what happens if we get a nation state incident. We get several every month. It's normal. So that's one thing. The second thing we do is we build resilience. So we have a whole series of programs, and CRA, which Lubna has referred to, is one of those things that are coming. The most, if you like, practical, demonstrable thing we've done in the resilience building space is something called NIS1, so the application of a European directive. So we've obliged 125 critical infrastructure operators in the state to take a series of regulatory measures, and that we've policed the bejesus out of that. Particularly where someone was recalcitrant or slow, we've dragged them through a process. We've applied pressure by whatever means we can, and then we've used compliance measures if we have to. We also then oblige them to report incidents to us, so they are compelled to tell us what's happening, and then they're also compelled to engage with us as we go through a process. Europe led on this. That doesn't exist in America in regulatory terms. So Europe has led the world in that. NIS2 is coming, hopefully very early next year. It's in law in Europe now. We have to do our piece of it yet in law, and that will increase in Ireland the number of compliant entities from 125 to of the order of 4,500. So again, that's a major step change in terms of how we regulate critical infrastructure. It will cover most of the public sector. It will cover new areas like manufacturing, like pharma, mentioned Johnson & Johnson. It'll cover a whole range of areas like that. And the last thing we do, and it's really important, cyber is a global phenomenon, unsurprisingly, because the internet is, and engaging with partners globally. Now, when I say partners, I mean intelligence services, security services, governments, NCSCs, private operators globally, and then domestically. And we have a long-standing and highly effective program called the CORES. These are coordination and response groups. which are entities that we run a series of, with 8 different cores covering energy, telecoms, transport, government, and so on, which allows us to engage directly with our key partners. We meet them every month. We provide threat intelligence, we provide training, we provide guidance and support. And in return, they tell us what their fears, hopes, and dreams are, and how we can best help them. That engagement piece allows us to go from, if you like, we had a meeting in Portlaoise during the week with the local government sector. We can go from that to the US government in a day. So we can take information from US to Louth County Council and backwards within a day. That's the engagement piece.
That makes us feel a little bit better. So it sounds like it's reasonably comprehensive. Lubna, did
Yeah.
you want anything to add?
So, just as Richard mentioned, phenomena, are we prepared for a phenomenon that happened in Portugal and Spain? You know, so that's one of the biggest questions. What if that happens in Ireland? What do we do? So coming back to there is, I looking more inside situations, looking at those type of risks and building that extent of resilience within infrastructures. And not only just looking at manufacturing and utilities and fintech, but also when we talk about Cyber Resilience Act, we're talking about the traffic lights, you know, the traffic lights. So there is radio equipment inside it, RED. So any type of exploitation that, you know, from our traffic lights going out of control to our IoT devices, to our nanny cams even, anything like small basic applications. And these can be used for a number of different type of point of breaches down there. Training people on these type of regulations enables them to understand, enforce security at a high common level of cybersecurity within their infrastructure, within their organizations, apply the standards, apply the frameworks. So if you look at 2019, barely 19 to 20% between that of industries implemented cybersecurity standards. And that's, again, namesake. That was mainly because of business benefits. And majority of those companies, even the biggest one, they suffered the cyber attack, which meant it was just for namesake. They didn't assess the risk appropriately. And that's what these regulations are doing. They're enforcing the companies from startups to small to medium enterprises to large enterprises, any person, any company dealing with your data, either that's personal data or manufacturing data, production data, to make sure that they're not just saying it, they're actually implementing security in place. So the programs that we're doing, let's say, just giving an example, for critical infrastructures or airports, as and it was mentioned, there's operational technology in banks, in airports, in aviation, in our shipping docks, everywhere. And those are IT, OT, as we connecting them together, like, you know, the Cloudflare incidents, AWS incidents, your IT, OT shuts down. Your IT has an incident, the whole infrastructure shuts down. So it's kind of a fully connected environment. And you have to look at, you know, in a layman's language, if you have a house and you have different points of entries, you have to put the same amount of security on different points of those entries to make sure nobody's using the front door, who's using the back door, who's using this or that. And that's what these regulations, the program that we're doing on OT security, it's to the industry, upskilling at the level 9, the managers, the CEOs, the people that hire in the chain, to train them to build an understanding what exactly the risks are. So people can transition from IT to OT, or they can transition from OT to IT. So building those transferable skills. So cyber is for everyone. So if you look at the periodic table of cyber skills, you can be an analyst, you can be a person from risk, you can be someone in compliance, you can be somebody, we need people from, you can be a pen tester, or you can be a standards person. So that's versatile, but we need to make sure all those checks are enforced appropriately to build cyber resilience. So it's not a one-man's job. We can't just say NCSE is doing the job from the national front, and then from academia, we're looking at how to different bachelor programs, different programs at the master's level, masters in cybersecurity. We have bachelors in cybersecurity and IT forensics. We have a new program, BA in law and cyber, and then again, the operation technology. So building, you know, upskilling at every single stage, like building those competencies, as I said, to reach to that goal where we're not just talking about in 5 years, we should talk about from 5% or from 1% to 20% or 30%, have those roles at all different levels, starting from school till the very level. That's how we can only build cyber resilience.
Okay, that's a nice perspective on how we go about fixing it. Brendan, did you want to add anything to that?
My only point would be that from a sort of sociological point of view or an institutional point of view, you're as cyber resilient as you have a deep and wide adaptive capacity, which comes from organizations like the National Cyber Centre, and the way in which Richard's described, they're not just sitting behind servers and fighting, whack-a-mole tech stuff. They're actually going out becoming enablers, right? But you also need your third sector, but you also need a very vibrant private sector. And the good news is we have a lot of tech startups. I'm not going to name individual ones. But from a sociological point of view, you're only as strong as how deep and rich that weave is. And like, for instance, Cyber Ireland, the organization which is run out of, I think, MTU, they have a clocking figure of somewhere around 200 plus members. People have paid to join them. I'm watching that, and I want to see that rise. And I would say that once you see that double within a certain period of time, that's showing you that you have 400 organizations in the Republic of Ireland, or in the island of Ireland as well, who have paid membership to be part of this cyber network, which is interested in cyber business opportunities, education, but also cyber security. And so the depth of the ecosystem of startups, of private firms, consultancies, of public sector expertise, of security expertise, of third sector, that's really what you need. And then networking them together. Because if you don't have that depth, you can't adapt. So what is resilience? The ability, it's hardening, it's toughness, right? But it's also the ability to come back after you've taken a hit. And I think the metaphor, I know that you had the RIA to be commended for this whole thematic serious and resilience, but my understanding of some of my discussions with coastal scientists is that a lot of the original work on resilience was done back in the 50s on sand dunes, coastal sand dunes. And the property of the sand dune is you have steady erosion from wind and wave every single day. And then you have these huge, humongous storms that are completely unpredictable, except that they're predictable in their unpredictability. And you have these two things leveraging, and yet the sand dunes are still there. And it turns out that the two biggest predictors of sand dune persistence is the width and the depth, the extent, how long it goes on for, and how far back it goes on to. If you have those two properties, it can take one hell of a hammering and it can come back and regrow. The same with a society. If it has that rich ecosystem of startups and third level and agencies like Richard's, if it has that, it has a chance. If it's too small, and we were too small when the HSE attack happened, we were just too small in terms of the level of expertise.
Richard, do you want to add to that?
I mean, I couldn't agree more. And Brendan, I'm stealing your coastal geomorphology answer, by the way. I'll have that. Materially, this is the really important thing. Cyber is a team sport. And the extent to which any one entity can genuinely deal with these issues is always going to be limited. I'll come back to the Portuguese, Spanish electricity, good example in a minute, but recently we had a significant incident in aviation where 4 airports in Europe were hit by a supply chain attack on some of the baggage handling systems. Berlin, Brandenburg, London Heathrow, Brussels, Zaventem, and Dublin. And the issue we had very quickly was that Dublin seemed to be working fine. Flights weren't delayed, or if they were, it wasn't by very much. While Heathrow and Zaventem and Berlin, but Berlin has its own problems historically, that airport has never really worked. We were seen to be working fine. And the reason was because the DAA, for lots of reasons, were very adaptive. They were able to very quickly get the system isn't working, take out the iPads we have prepared for exactly this eventuality, and run it from a localized system. And they could keep going. That's the adaptive capacity. And that was something that they had done partly because of their work with us under NIS1 on supply chain risk management and on resilience, partly because that's what they knew they had to do. We see the same thing, and the electricity grid is a great example. The Spanish and Portuguese, it was the Spanish ultimately who did it, got their grid from a black start up and running within about 4 or 5 hours. Given their constraints and the amount of solar they have in the system, that was very impressive. We practice exactly the same thing. And that flexibility and that adaptiveness doesn't just come by accident. It comes from years of hard work and years of planning. And this is what I meant at the outset when I mentioned substrate. It's not just, are you cyber resilient? It is, how resilient are you, full stop. And cyber builds upon that capability. We're lucky in this state in that we have very strong institutions in airgrid and DSP networks and in other private sector utilities who can actually bring the technical capability to bear regardless of the sector. And the work that they've been able to do with us and ensuring or assuring us on their own capability and resilience is instrumental. They can demonstrate that they're ready.
Am I hearing two different messages here? On the one hand, we didn't have enough resources to manage the HSE, and on the other hand, we're all sorted on the electricity grid. So, for example,
I would make a distinction between airgrid and the HSE, but that's a different conversation. The HSE incident was a really unique one in the sense that it was probably the worst incident in terms of numbers of endpoints affected in history, not just in Ireland, globally in history. It was a huge incident. The issues behind it are spectacular, and they were published in the PwC report, which if you want to look at a catalogue of failures, it's worth looking at, how things shouldn't happen. At the time, NCSC was 25 people, 26. And we were, and I was in the Department of Taoiseach at the time, and I ran the incident from Taoiseach's perspective. We were able to manage the incident, but it took all hands on deck. Since that time, we've built a national cyber emergency plan. We've published our national plan for responding to issues. There's still going to be issues. DAA still had an outage. They recovered from it, but they still had an issue. So we will never be right. We will never be perfect, but we are advancing towards better, at least.
So you're telling us that we can relax to some extent, that Ireland is reasonably well prepared. Like, I mean, is our water safe, for example? I mean, that's not cyber. I mean, can somebody go up to a reservoir and put something unpleasant into the water? I mean, how safe is our water? How safe is our energy? How safe is our transport systems? All these important systems.
So we talk about risk, and the answer is they're all at risk all the time. The resilience of each of these will vary by sector, by time, by even the day of the you're talking about in question. When you look at this from a collective perspective, the only way of dealing with this is regulatory type solutions. But after that, you end up talking about resourcing very quickly, because you can regulate all you want, but unless someone's going to take the investment in drinking water supply, for example, and we regulate drinking water supply right now under NIS1, and it's been a long journey, and there's still significant challenges. So sector by sector, it will vary. Frankly, engineers are great. If you have a sector that was run by engineers for a long time, they will likely have gotten there ahead of you in lots of cases. But in areas like drinking water supply, where we've a historic underinvestment, you're going to have more problems. So that stochastic risk question will be with us forever, unfortunately.
Okay. Brendan, have you anything to add to that?
No, it's just that the resilience mindset is always that you don't just sit back and say, I can relax. It's quite the opposite. You're ready to accept that bad things will happen, right? The storms will come and interfere with your sand dune life and the steady erosion, but you have that ability to come back from it. That's the point, I think, and you're prepared.
Yeah, it's just resonating in a different way, like being proactive. Like that's one of the things. Doing those, like a lot of companies or industries who come to our OT program, they do stress test, they do these drills. They're kind of, it's not just if an incident happens, they're kind of using the range that gives you an ability to simulate different cyber attacks and look, can we be exploited through this kind of incident as well? Just like a WannaCry incident that impacted 120 countries across the globe. So kind of they do bring those technologies and run them to look at what extent they can be exploited. What are the risks? Can they escalate? Can they be at a certain point or not? So again, detect, protect, respond, have the ability to keep that operational resilience. And I really like the example Richard mentioned, when plant A is compromised, it's not that you should already have a plan B or plant B running. So the minute that one is down, the operations are not compromised. You just switch to another place, a very secure recovery site, a backup site from where you can just operate. And even if the first site takes 24 hours, 48 hours, doesn't matter. The rest of everything, all the operations, all the critical infrastructure and things are running. And that's kind of,
Is that not nice in theory, though? It sounds expensive. Can every company do that?
It is. And this is a real example. So I'll just filter it out because it's from one of the companies relating to not Johnson & Johnson, another company down there, pharmaceutical. And for them, it was critical that they have to generate, they were producing a certain drug, which was very critical. So life and death scenarios, they have to manufacture certain batches in a day and then ship them. So logistically, it's not just about their profit, it's about if they don't manufacture them, they won't be able to ship them and it won't reach to a certain point and they can't treat people. And for them, it's like, this is 3 years back when it's like, Lubna, what do we do? How do we build it? And they were one of those industries who like, if we're looking at state-sponsored crimes or, you know, countries who do fintech-based cybercrime. So these are the ones, if their intellectual property is stolen or something stolen, they might have implications. I won't go there again, but so it's kind of, for them, it's critical to manufacture. They need operation resilience. And that's what the strategy was. And the company said, yes, it would be expensive, but then we need to have not just another belt, we need to have 3 more belts. And again, look at if one is down, another one can manufacture, because this is a life-saving drug. There's no other exception. I would give it back to the espionage thing to you, Richard.
You were talking about North Korea, just for the record. Just on that question, and this is the paradox in all of this, big companies can afford multiple plants. Where they're making lots of money. Big organizations can afford multiplicity, redundancy, and capability, but smaller entities can't. And one of the fundamental challenges in a state of this size, particularly in government, is that you've lots of small entities who don't have that strength in depth and the capability to do this. We can do some of the work and some of the heavy lifting in driving out some of the risk, but sometimes, and I forgive anybody from Kerry in the audience, it's like asking a Kerry man for directions. If I was going for there, I wouldn't start from here. I wouldn't start from local entities running all of their own IT. I would look at centralizing and driving change. That's an investment, but that's a risk-based investment government will have to look at in due course. It's not just we can spend all the money in the world. Sometimes you need to actually change the question.
Okay, thanks for that. So, Richard, you had a nice example earlier of an adaptive capacity where the DAA were able to cope with that outage. Are there concerns there? I mean, do you do large-scale attack simulations? And are you concerned with the relationships and how say public and private work together? Are there silos here that don't talk to each other? Are there any concerns in that area?
Yes, and all that happens. Simple answer, including silos not speaking and everything else. So again, like I mentioned, we have a national cyber emergency plan, so a published plan for how we will respond to major emergencies. And we exercise that at a national level in conjunction with major sectors. So 2 years ago, we ran an incident, a full day of crisis response planning and exercise on Dublin Port. And just to map out what that looks like, we have a national strategic emergency management process, which is run out of the Department of Defence. It's in Ag House, just over there. And that process is chaired by a lead government department, and we're the lead government department for cyber incidents. So we ran a full day where I was in the chair with Dublin Port, Rosslare, Cork, Foynes, and then 100 other people, literally 100 people in the room, from the Gardaí, the Defence Forces, local authorities, Dublin Airport, literally everybody who could conceivably be affected by this, running literally, this is what we would do in an incident. And then we had nearly 100 people online, including colleagues from Northern Ireland, colleagues from NCSC UK, colleagues from around the country. This is exactly how we'd manage an incident live. And everybody had their playbooks and their process. So we do this fairly regularly at a national level and then also on a regional level. So we do it in local authorities on small reports, issues like that. So it's utterly critical. And it doesn't always go well. There were always challenges. And the silos issue is a key part of that. You may expect that everybody knows everybody, that everybody can talk to everybody, but it often isn't the case. So the after-action review process for those exercises is critical. And it's one of the reasons why we leverage the NIS1 compliance process so heavily, because it gives us the tools to do something about it after the fact. This is always a learning process. We're forever basically synthesizing an understanding of the nature of the risk, synthesizing an understanding of what is actually happening on the ground, then using one to drive out risk. It is highly, highly variegated, lots of success in some areas, real risks in others. So there's always going to be a process here.
Brendan, your expertise is in marine. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the maritime exercise that he talked about is like it's very good to hear that the Irish state is getting this capability to do these things together. By the way, there's also been continuing this exercise. MTU this September ran a series of, well, one day workshop with the Naval Service where they were basically doing a smaller version, I think, a less elaborate version than what Richard describes. That to me is really important that you're continuing on. You're not doing just a one-off simulation, which is this beautiful moment, and then everyone goes home to their silos. You have to do it over and over and over again. The countries that are doing the simulations the most now tend to be the Scandinavians and the Nordics, and they're typically doing it not so much in cyber, although that's always integrated, right? But in hybrid situations. But I think there's two learnings that come out of that. One is that you have to repeat the simulations, you have to include people, you have to extract the lessons learned. That's kind of military terminology, and the military sociology, and that's very interesting, which is that the lessons are clear, the lessons are documented, and then immediately forgotten and put on a shelf. So you need champions to go out and bring the lessons learned to the Garda Síochána, to the Defence Forces, to whoever the various stakeholders are. They mightn't be necessarily the two most important stakeholders. Some of the stakeholders could be private sector actors, right? So there's a piece of work in Ireland's really good at getting ideas. Ireland's really good at processing ideas. Ireland is really good at communicating. We're not great on execution and delivery and implementation.
Richard's going to sort all that out.
I meant generally the state capacity, not in cyber. I think the National Cyber Centre is a model in many ways, right? But it's overall in terms of security and defence policy. We decide we want to increase the level of ambition, but we haven't reached that spending level yet. So I think what I'm concerned about there is ramping up and getting those lessons out and getting those lessons across.
It's important to have the sociologists involved in that for sure. Just for the last few minutes now, maybe I'll switch tack considerably, and I just say two words and ask you to expand. Misinformation, deepfakes. Discuss. Who wants to do that one?
I'm on the hot seat. Deepfakes, I think I'll say it in terms of digital identity fraud. So when we have digital wallets, how important will that, or how, if deepfake, if it's not controlled, if it's not mitigated or neutralized, it will compromise the financial aspect massively. And again, if we're talking about, like in Estonia, they say e-Estonia. If we're talking about e-Ireland, where again, your facial recognition, your biometric is everything, that deep fake will exploit, will put you at risk at massive levels. But that's certainly there. Now, when we're talking about this certain domain, the risks associated to Web 4.0, let me tell you from a standards perspective, the standards are not developed yet because I'm working standards. So there is a massive risk. And one of the projects, again, we have done a number of demos to find the backdoors, to find the things inside this. So deepfake is, I would say, it's a massive risk. How do we control it? That's something ongoing, I would say. I won't just say, oh yeah, we got a solution to it, because the extent of it will be fully realized when we actually have a digital wallet and digital identities flowing through. And that's when people start exploiting those services. I would leave it to Richard now.
I'm loath to even start because you said 2 minutes and there's no way on earth I'd address it properly in 2 minutes. I think there's a lot in this. Starting from the very top. Mis, dis, and malinformation, so MDM as it's kind of technically described, is usually a tool used by state actors as part of information operations. The Russian term, by the way, is not hybrid, it's information operations. They regard cyber as just one tool in this compendium of information operations tools. However, and it's used for this destabilization for political purposes and for a whole range of other things in that kind of context. However, as Lubna has pointed out, we've seen it here. The use of deepfakes for criminal purposes, we've seen one in the recent presidential election campaign, although that seems to have been just a prank, but still effective nevertheless. So this degradation of digital identity and degradation to an extent of what is and is not reality is a pressing problem in a number of different dimensions. one would hope that there are going to be tool sets, AI detection and so on. Maybe steganography will deal with some of these issues, but there doesn't seem to be anything right now. What the state can do in the background to prepare for this. So we have an electoral stability group, which is run by the Electoral Commission, but we're a part of it, which deal with some of the risks and threats to the security and integrity of the electoral process. We do risk assessments for elections and so on. So we can deal with the getting the message out piece. We can deal with that this is false, ignore it stuff. That's fine until the volume rises to a point you can't deal with it. This is an issue which we don't have an answer right now, either in the electoral sense or in the criminal sense. For example, it's very likely when it comes out that the Jaguar Land Rover operation, the criminal ransomware group, is likely to have used some deepfake technology to pretend to be somebody they weren't in that process. That's a challenge for everybody, not just government, but for anybody paying a bill, anybody procuring something. How do you know if the person you're speaking to is who they claim to be? That's one of those future-facing risks we're talking about. The world is changing very quickly. It's changing in ways that are very difficult to predict. And it seems likely that the nature and extent of that change is going to accelerate. That's why the National Cyber Risk Assessment will call a lot of this out in very blunt terms.
Couple of quick points. We're always excited by what I would call charismatic misinformation or disinformation events, so deep fakes. So misinformation, it's accidental or non-malign intent. Disinformation, somebody sat down and planned this either for commercial gain or for state action or for ideological impact. But the two increasingly blur. And I think what we begin to notice, particularly as AI maybe becomes more prevalent, is that particularly with state actors or well-organized actors, that a lot of misinformation and disinformation is going to become an industrial generic product that is massified and scaled up. So it becomes almost background noise in a lot of the social media, which is very different from the charismatic, disturbing video that was released of our president, which gets a lot of attention. But this stuff we don't really notice. It's just interfering. So the literature I was trying to follow in Ukraine, I was talking to Ukrainians in Galway about this, is that they're being bombarded with negative stories about the soldiers. Negative stories about, unhappy stories about basically designed to lower morale, to cause confusion, to lower the whole mood. And how does propaganda work? All the classical, again, social psychological studies say propaganda is most effective, not when it gets to change your position, but you don't know what to believe in anymore. You don't know what to trust and you're just confused. There's this background noise. So I think the big problem with misinformation and disinformation is this weed effect, that like weeds, it begins to populate in the background through our social media channels that we all more or less end up using in some shape or form. That percolates into the old regular media and it percolates into the national conversation. So the national conversation on migration is steadily poisoned over a period of 10 years and we don't realize it, like weeds growing in a field. And I think that's the model that we have to be more alert to. So in some ways, I'm less concerned about the charismatic deep fakes. I mean, obviously they're horrific for the people involved. It's very disturbing what's going on with the technology, but I'm more concerned about the pernicious, slow, slop that AI is capable and how that could be used by certain state actors, I won't mention which ones, who have a modus operandi of industrial production of information operations, as Richard called.
I would certainly share those concerns as well. Just looking at the time, I think I might hand over to, if anyone has any questions that you'd like to throw in.